afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us for this incredibly important and timely Delegate U, Redistricting 101. Today, we're going to go over what redistricting is, its importance and impact, and help answer any questions you may have. Speaking of questions, please use the Q&A function to enter your questions, as we'll have a Q&A session with all of our speakers after our presentations. First, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Michael Wagaman. Michael serves as the lead co-chair for CDP's Credentials Committee and head of Wagaman Strategies. He has worked on redistricting policy since 1997 and consulted with organizations working throughout the country to bring redistricting commission to other states with local jurisdictions throughout California transitioning to district elections under the California Voting Rights Act. In the build-up to the 2021 redistricting, Michael has consulted with the California State Legislature on their redistricting mandates, including the legislative strike process, providing public access to redistricting software, and the creation of the official redistricting database. Please welcome Michael.
Thank you, Olivia, and welcome to everyone who's participating. Do we want to go ahead and bring up the PowerPoint? So I'm going to be talking about the state redistricting process just to orient folks to where we are in that process and kind of the generalized rules that govern that process. So we move to the next slide. I will start again by talking about the selection process for the new commission because they just formed in August, and that was the culmination of a more than year-long process to pick the new members of our new commission who are going to be in charge of redrawing the state Assembly, Senate, Congressional, and Board of Equalization districts. So the way the selection process works is it starts with a process where most Californians are eligible to apply to be a member of the commission. The only restrictions are you have to have been registered with the same political party for 5 years. You have to have voted in at least 2 of the last 3 general elections. And then there's a host of disqualifiers for potential conflicts of interest, which you can see on the screen. Notably, while I said most Californians would be eligible to apply for this commission, probably almost all of the participants on this webinar would not be qualified because among the disqualifiers are that if you are a county or if you are a central committee member, meaning state or county, in the last 10 years, or any of your immediate family were, you would have been disqualified from applying. So without those basic disqualifiers, though, if we move on to the next slide, that still left a lot of people who were eligible to apply, and a lot of people did. You see almost 21,000 people applied. That initial application process that's listed was actually a relatively simple process in that all that anybody had to do was they had to basically provide their basic contact information. They had to provide their basic contact information. They had to verify that they did not have any of those disqualifiers. And that was all that was really required of them for that initial application. The supplemental application, you see there's a big drop with only 2,000 people who basically finished that process. That's because the supplemental application was very complicated. They had to write 4 different essays. They had to do a host of additional disclosures, not only about themselves, but about their families. They had to provide a complete work history. They had to provide disclosures about all their volunteer activities, extracurricular activities. So it is very much a college application on steroids that people had to go through. So once those 2,000 people, though, did apply, there were 3 members of the staff of the California State Auditor's Office who were in charge of going through those applications and ultimately selecting the 60 most qualified applicants. What you see described on the screens is described in law as having relevant analytical skills and ability to be impartial and an appreciation of the state's diversity, with the goal of ultimately creating a commission that was independent of legislative influence and reasonably representative of the state's diversity. So what those 3 auditors did is they took those 2,000 applicants, they picked 120 people to interview. They started that interview process right in the middle of the COVID lockdowns beginning. So some of the interviews were before the lockdown and most of them were after, ultimately picking the 60, what they considered most qualified applicants. And if we move on to the next slide, You'll see the next process there was that there was a series of preemptory strikes by legislative leaders, after which reduced the pool down to 36. Out of those 36, the first 8 were picked by random. And when I say random, I really mean it. It was bingo balls. It was quite literally bingo balls who picked the first 8 commissioners. And then those 8 commissioners were then charged with picking 6 additional commissioners from that remaining pool, with a specific charge that they look at diversity as one of the criteria in picking those additional commissioners. That process was a little messy this time, but the result at the end of the day was a commission that is incredibly diverse, particularly when you consider that by law, it has to have 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 people not registered with one of the 2 major parties. And despite that kind of partisan balance being hardwired in, you ended up with a commission that is a majority women. You have 4 Latinos, 4 Asians, 3 African Americans, 2 self-identify as LGBTQ, 2 are under the age of 35. That is far younger than last time. Indeed, the commission this time is about 10 years younger on average than the commission 10 years ago. 1 identifies as disabled. So one of the things I point out on this new commission, despite having 14 members, there is not a single straight white male who isn't in a wheelchair among the 14. So it is an incredibly diverse group, split evenly between the North and the South. If we move on to the next slide, there you go. You can see them on the screen. That is from one of their recent meetings. You can tell one of the things that is immediately different, even from the last commission, is that they're doing this by Zoom, just like all of us are. So they do not have the advantage of being able to meet face to face. But beyond just their demographic diversity, is an incredibly diverse group as far as background. So you have 1 individual who does international election observations for the UN professionally. You have an architect, a political science professor, epidemiologist, community organizers. So it really is a range of people who have a lot of different experiences and a lot of different backgrounds that they are bringing to this process. So it really is reflective of what was the voter intent, which is to take the hands out of the experts of redistricting and move it on to a more citizens-oriented group. We move on to the next slide. If we can advance the slide. So what are those 14 people going to be doing? What is the law that governs this process? First, a little terminology. Because these are 2 terms people mix up, even people who do this professionally. Reapportionment is a term you're going to hear a lot for the rest of the year, because this is what the lawsuit that's heading before the Supreme Court right now is about. And reapportionment is very narrowly about deciding how many congressional seats each state gets. So that's all reapportionment is deciding how many seats each state will receive. Redistricting, which is what we're talking about, what the state commission will be doing, is the process of taking those districts and dividing the state into those new district boundaries. And as you can see in the hypothetical geography on the right with 16 dots meaning 16 people, there are lots of ways you can do that. And the important thing to know is, without more information, there's no way to know if those are quote unquote good or bad lines, just based on looking at abstract shapes, because you really need to look at how those lines functionally work, because how those lines are drawn at the end of the day will affect how people are represented. And that's what the redistricting process ultimately is about, is representation. So we walk through go to the next slide. I'm not going to linger on this slide, just to say that there's both federal law and state law that governs this process. We'll walk through some of those state criterion. As I do walk through those criteria, one thing to just note is that they are ranked in an order of preference in California. So as we walk through these criteria, what you hear first is by law more important than what you hear second. So if there's a conflict between criteria, you look at the ones that are higher on the list, and those get priority over ones lower on the list. So we advance to the next slide. If we advance, so Before I walk through those criteria, I want to be very explicit, particularly for this crowd, about what this process is not. And it is a process that is not designed, or is designed to take the political part out of the redistricting process, or at least limit its scope. So this is everything you see on the screen is actually in law. This is actually state law or state constitution, saying that districts shall not be drawn to favor or discriminate against an incumbent candidate or political party. I will note there that is different from some other states that have commissions. So for example, Arizona is required to try to draw seats to be competitive. That is not the law in California. It is more of a good process, willful blindness, that if you have good process, you get to good outcomes, but they are not supposed to be drawing lines to either favor or disfavor a party. It's supposed to just kind of let the chips fall where they may. They can't look at where individuals and potential candidates are living. And we're going to talk about communities of interest in a little bit. And critically, those are not defined as relationships with a political party, incumbent, or political candidates. So it's easy to say, my community, everybody has Joe Biden signs in front of their houses. That's really not what this commission is looking at, and really not the way they by law are allowed to define communities. So if we advance. Equal population, this is what the classic one person, one vote. If you look on the graphs on the right, you'll see the purple district has 6 dots, while the yellow district only has 2 dots. So those are not of equal size. This is something that seems relatively straightforward as a concept, but if we advance the slide, you'll see that it actually does get a little bit more complicated than that. So for example, for Congress, what the courts have said is basically you should get as nearly close as practicable. While state, it's reasonably equal. So for state lines and for local lines, when the assembly member speaks in a moment, they have a little bit more flexibility than you might have for congressional lines. As folks may or may not know, there's actually ongoing federal litigation about whether undocumented should be counted for purposes of reapportionment, and that's critical. So the lawsuit that is ongoing against the Trump administration's efforts to not count undocumented is just about how many congressional seats California will get, and it could have a very negative effect on how many seats California gets. But under California law, they have to be used for purposes of redistricting. So those populations will be counted for purposes of the redistricting on both the state and local level. The other thing that is new on equal population, showing where all this stuff can get complicated, is a new law that is just taking effect, requires that California adjusts for incarcerated persons. So if you are in a state facility, you would be reassigned back to where you lived before you were incarcerated, not the actual prison facility itself. So that is something that was not done in 2011 and is being done for the first time in 2021. So if we advance the slide, I'm not going to linger on these points. These are critical because it is the second most important criteria. Talking about the Federal Voting Rights Act, but Roz Gold from NALEO is going to talk about that. So I'm just going to briefly say that this is complicated because there's conflicting guidance under the law and from the courts. So for example, under the Federal Voting Rights Act, you have to avoid vote dilution, which is basically depriving a protected class from their ability to elect the candidates of their choice, while at the same time, under the 14th Amendment, race cannot be the predominant factor in drawing lines. So you have to consider race, but at the same time, you can't consider race too much. So it gets a little complicated. And if we advance the slide, again, I'm not going to linger on this too much, but to qualify under the Federal Voting Rights Act, there are certain criteria that have to be met. One of which is that that population not only has to be protected, but it has to be sufficiently large. So this is something that is about relatively large groups of people that are geographically concentrated, because you have to be able to draw a district around them fundamentally. Once you have that population, though, there are different ways that those populations have been disenfranchised in the past, which the Federal Voting Rights Act is designed to prevent. One is cracking, which is basically you take a population and split up into a lot of little districts or a lot of districts so that they can't elect in any. The other is packing, where you put a population that may be able to elect in 2 districts, and instead you shove them all into one so that they can only elect in 1 district. So if you imagine those red dots on the side, you can see examples of that. I think Ms. Gold is going to show you some more, so I will move this along and ask for the next slide. Contiguity, another one that seems pretty simple. You can see on the right, the purple district, the 1 dot isn't touching the rest of the district. That would be considered non-contiguous. There are nuances to this as well. Where does Catalina go? Is the bridge that connects Coronado to the rest of San Diego considered contiguous or not? So there are nuances even in relatively simple concepts. We advance the slide. City, county, neighborhood, and communities of interest, that those should be tried to be kept together. Notably, those are all held equal. So a community is just as important as a city, just as important as a county boundary. You have to look at them all equally. And they are something that is considered more important than other things that people might often think about in redistricting. So again, on the chart on the right, you could imagine those 4 red dots being a well-defined community of interest. For example, the downtown of a community. And you can see it's been, even though those 4 districts look very pretty, being nice little squares, they have functionally split that community of interest into 4 different districts. So pretty doesn't always mean good in redistricting. Cities and counties are concepts that are defined. Most people understand those. They're defined by law. Communities of interest, if we move on to the next slide, are a little bit more complicated. This is actually the text again from state law. I'm not going to linger on it other than to say, again, it's people who have a common interest who want to be kept together so that they can have effective and fair representation. And the law, as you can see on the list, is very open on how that can be defined. It does not narrowly limit what defines a community other than saying it is in a relationship with a candidate or a political party. If we advance the slide. Compactness, this is generally considered the visual test, the I'll know it when I see it test. So if you look on the right, that is kind of a traditional way of looking at compactness, which is the squares are considered more compact than the kind of more funky shapes on the right. What I will note, though, is state law is a little different from how people often think about compactness in that it does not actually favor abstract shapes, and it doesn't say favor any of the very many statistical measures that have been invented by political scientists over the years. What California law says, and if we advance to the next slide, is that districts shall be drawn to avoid bypassing one population for another. So you can kind of see an example of this on the right. This is a slide from a law professor at Loyola Marymount, where you can see the kind of white and purple districts look kind of pretty. They look like they have nice straight lines. Those are county lines, so they are generally following county lines. But anyone who knows the valley knows if you look on the right, what that is functionally doing is that kind of greenish shaped district is coming down the valley, except it's skipping over half of the city of Fresno to go down further into Kings. So that would be considered a less compact district, even though it is visually pleasing. It's not the way California defines compactness. We move to the next slide. Nesting. This is something for people who were around in politics in the 90s probably remember, because that's the way the lines were drawn, which is that you take 2 assembly districts, you shove them together, you make a Senate district. You take 5 Senate districts, you shove them together, and you make a BOE district. What's important here is that this is the least important criterion under state law. So it is something you do only if it doesn't conflict with all of the other things I talked about. And people might be like, well, of course, if your assembly districts are compliant, your Senate districts you can nest and they'll be compliant. But that's not always the case. And you'll see that example on the left. Let's say those red dots represent a protected class under the Voting Rights Act. in the assembly district, you can see they would make up a majority of that purple district and that blue district. So they are able to elect in both of those assembly seats. If you imagine nesting them, though, which is that kind of thick blue line on the left, they only make up 3 of the people in each of those districts and aren't able to elect in either Senate district, versus if you didn't nest, as shown on the right, they actually would be able to elect in one of those Senate districts. So there are actually good reasons sometimes that nesting does not make sense and why it's the lowest ranked criterion. I know we're getting close on time, so if we advance the slide, I can wrap up here. Just a note on timeline. One thing that is different from the last commission is this commission formed much earlier. The last commission didn't form until December, so they wouldn't even have existed right now, while this one's already been hard at work since August. The other part is that we have a lot of fuzziness still about when this process is going to wrap. Normally, the process is required to end August 15th. However, due to uncertainty about when the census is going to complete itself and when census data is going to be available, the California legislature actually sued on behalf of the commission, and the state Supreme Court extended the deadline to December 15th. However, they said that if the data becomes available earlier, they should try to speed up the process, but they didn't require it. So we know the lines are going to be finished sometime between August and December. Exactly when is still an open item. So we will continue to follow up with folks and keep people informed as that kind of part of the process firms up. If we move to the next slide, I think that is just my contact information, which I know they're going to post these PowerPoints so you don't have to write them down quickly. And with that, I will just say thank you on the last slide and hand it back.
Thank you so much, Michael. Up next, we have Rosalind Gold. Rosalind serves as the Chief Public Policy Officer with NALEO Education Fund, where she has worked for more than 3 decades on policy analyses and research for the organization's Latino civic engagement efforts. Rosalind coordinates the research for several of the NALEO Education Fund's publications and has extensive policy expertise in the areas of newcomer civic integration, election reform, voting rights, redistricting, and the census. Her most recent efforts have focused on how to strengthen democratic processes during the COVID-19 pandemic. She has delivered testimony before many public and private committees and commission hearings and has served on governmental commissions. She also currently serves on the board of directors of the National Institute on Money and Politics and as chair of the Future of California Elections Board of Advisors. Please help me welcome Rosalind.
Great. So thank you so much, Olivia. Thank you for all of the participants. Thank you to the executive board. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to engage in a discussion about the Voting Rights Act, its importance for redistricting, and how it's really going to raise some emerging issues as we go through this redistricting cycle. And if my PowerPoint, great. Thank you so much. So next slide. I'm Rosalind Gold, Chief Public Policy Officer with the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, NALEO Educational Fund, and we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. And our mission is to facilitate full Latino participation in the political process. Next slide. So when we started to do work on redistricting, and we're actively engaged for a couple of decades, but particularly in the last redistricting cycle in California, which is the first that we had the commission, we came up with our overriding principles and priorities to guide our work. First of all, we believe the commission must provide Latinos with a fair opportunity to choose their elected representatives, to choose who will speak on behalf of them in our democracy. And so compliance with the US Constitution, which is another way of saying equal population, and the Federal Voting Rights Act compliance must be the top criteria, which is very much echoed in what the criteria are for the commission. We think the process that the commission follows has to be transparent. The public must be able to understand what the commission is doing and be provided an opportunity, a meaningful opportunity to participate in the process. And then finally, we believe the commission, and any commission that does redistricting or any other entity, must reflect the geographic, ethnic, racial diversity of the jurisdiction. And we were very active. One of the reasons the commission is as diverse as it is this time is because once the first 8 commissioners were chosen and there were no Latinos, we worked with many of you to ensure that Latinos would be part of the second 6 commissioners that were chosen. Thank you. Next slide. And our activities include working with our sister organization, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. We're going to be working again to mobilize Latinos to participate in the redistricting process. We're going to continue advocating with the commission on a variety of matters and look at their draft maps. And then we're also going to work with coalitions, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a unity mapping effort. So that's our organization, our activities. The next slide. So as a way of talking about why the Voting Rights Act is important and also how is it related to the census, I want to just kind of repeat some of the themes that Michael raised. Why do we redistrict in the first place? Well, because to make sure that people have an equal voice, equal population, each district must have the same number of residents. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. But over time, with population change, the districts become uneven in size. People move from one place to another. There's different growth rates. Next slide. Next slide. So we have to go back to make those population numbers equal. Next slide. And this is important why we have to have good quality, fair, and accurate census data, because it's that census data that determines what the population size of the state and the number of residents we have. Next slide. Great. And next slide. So, how does the Voting Rights Act fit into us? Well, generally, the Voting Rights Act generally prohibits discrimination in any kind of voting or elections or any procedure that denies the right to vote for protected classes. Okay? In the redistricting context, we tend to use the Voting Rights Act to protect the rights of groups to have a meaningful opportunity to elect the candidates of their choice. Again, to choose their elected representatives. And how can you change and play with district lines to dilute or bridge minority voting rights? Next slide. Well, if you take a look at this jurisdiction, and you'll see that there are, it looks like 4 Latinas, I'll call them, but this could be any protected group, right? This could be Asians, this could be Blacks. The little icons there just represent a group that is protected, right? So next slide. You see how if you draw the lines this way, you basically have only one member of the protected group in each district, and therefore they cannot really determine the outcome or even have a meaningful say in the outcome of elections in each of those districts. Next slide. Yeah, like I said, here we've got Latinos making up 1/4 of each of the districts. Next slide. However, you see if you just draw the district lines this way, next slide, you have Latinos have enough presence to determine the outcome of what the elections are going to be, enough of a strong voice to determine the outcomes of those elections. Next slide. So line drawing matters. Michael had referred to the Jingles criteria. And basically what you're looking for if you're trying to determine if either there's a violation or compliance, as Michael had mentioned, the protected group has to be both large and geographically compact. There has to be a sizable, relatively concentrated communities of protected groups. And the population information that we generally use is what share does that group constitute of the citizen voting age population. So in other words, as a shorthand, you can see a lot of language in rulings and in demography that says if the protected group is over 50% of the citizen voting age population of the district, then you have a district, you better make sure those communities are kept together. In addition, the protected groups must be politically cohesive, and you have to have the risk of these groups being outvoted, and here's this by white majority voters, vote sufficiently as a bloc. So you have to know what the electoral preferences are, both of the protected group and the electoral preferences of the majority population. Because if those preferences, if they are continually voting for different candidates, then you have racially polarized voting. And racially polarized voting analyses tend to be done with a lot of very sophisticated statistical techniques. But what they really mean as a bottom line is that the protected group generally and consistently has strong and different electoral preferences, whether it's on ballot measures, whether it's candidates, than the majority group does. So they are at risk of being outvoted if they are not kept together in a district. Next slide. Other criteria that are looked at are, what are called the totality of circumstances criteria. Everything from the history of discrimination against the protected group in the district, the extent to which minorities have less opportunity in education or health or anything that affects their ability to participate effectively in the political process, the extent to which minorities have been elected or not elected, the extent to which political campaigns have been characterized by racial appeals. This is a long list of criteria, lots of things that are relevant. So this list here isn't exhausted, but I just want to give you a sense of what are the types of things we look at to determine whether or not there's Voting Rights Act compliance with a map. Next slide. I just wanted to end by talking about a few emerging issues as we look forward to our work on the Voting Rights Act in this redistricting cycle. So as you can tell, in determining whether there's compliance with the Voting Rights Act is really a mixture of science and art, okay? You first of all have to start with geographic information, population information, voting data, historical information, and you have to kind of sort of look at this map of the state and look at where there are possibilities for Voting Rights Act compliant districts. Then you have to go back to your data. Then you have to go back to the map, and it's very iterative. And because it has this component of being a really art type of process, this is one of the reasons that nesting is a low criteria. It's because nesting does not give you the flexibility to do all the tweaking you need to do to make sure that there are VRA compliant districts, as well as some of the other criteria. Because of the sort of rigidity of nesting, you really lose flexibility to achieve your other redistricting goals. Okay. Michael had talked about some of the uncertainty about the deadlines. I did want to talk about one other emerging issues, which is the Trump administration, right after it couldn't get the addition of the citizenship question on the Census 2020 questionnaire, the Trump administration asked for there to be an executive order that would put together a file of data down to the block group that would identify the immigration status of every person in the United States and could be essentially matched with the overall data, the census file that is used for redistricting. Well, the information that the administration wanted the Bureau to use to come up with this file are things like administrative records, other records, which are really, bad data. This file is going to be useless, but could be used in ways to harm Latino voting rights and the voting rights of other protected groups. This is not so much of an issue in California. We are not going to be likely to be even using this file, but we're keeping an eye on this, and there's also litigation. The final issue, and I'll wrap up with this, is that we're really going to have to keep an eye out on how can we do unity mapping, right? Since we have so many diverse members of the population from different groups in different parts of the state, and they live close together, how do we create maps that ensure that Latinos and African Americans, for example, in South LA, or Latinos and Asian Pacific Islanders in the San Gabriel Valley, all have an opportunity for fair representation? So we are going to continue to be working on these issues, continue to be working on this commission and advocating with commission. Thank you so much. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Thank you so much, Rosalind. And I appreciate the shout out to the San Gabriel Valley. Our next speaker is the Honorable Rob Bonta, representing Assembly District 18, which includes Oakland, Alameda, and San Leandro. Assemblymember Bonta is California's first Filipino-American legislator and serves as the Assistant Majority Leader in the California State Assembly. He fought for California's immigrants and against the ban, the wall, mass deportations, kids in cages, and the direct transfer to ICE of Californians released from prisons and jails. During the COVID-19 pandemic, he fought for a no-cuts budget so education, healthcare, and our safety net services for our most vulnerable will be properly funded. Assemblymember Bonta has also pledged to continue fighting for the California Green New Deal to combat climate change through the lens of equity. Please welcome Assemblymember Bonta.
Thank you, Olivia. Appreciate the very kind and generous introduction. And good afternoon, Democrats. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you're healthy, safe, and well during these very difficult times as we together stare down a public health pandemic, economic recession, racial justice reckoning, ongoing fight against the climate crisis, homelessness, and housing affordability so much, and appreciate your commitment to our shared values here in the Democratic Party to fight for an inclusive California, California for all, with opportunity, equity, and justice for all Californians. So appreciate you. Hopefully you're breathing a little sigh of relief post-election. I know I'm pumped, and you are as well, for Biden-Harris as the Assembly member for the 18th Assembly District, Oakland, Alameda, and San Leandro. Just deeply proud that Oakland is in the White House with Kamala Harris, a daughter of Oakland, now as our soon-to-be sworn-in vice president, our vice president-elect. And thank you for all of you who are being engaged and continuing to fight. I know you must be tired after a grueling election season. So your ongoing support and effort and engagement coming right back to continue the fight to strengthen our democracy is recognized, deeply appreciated, and I'm proud and honored to fight with you. Still a lot more work to do. And when you have an election like we just did, there are some things on it that are exciting and invigorating and inspiring, and some things that are disappointing and frustrating and deflating. And it's always a mixed bag. Democracy works in the zigs and zags. And so for those of you who were part of campaigns that were successful, whether it be measures or candidates, congratulations. Now the hard work of governance begins, and we got to roll up our sleeves, work together. And for those of you who didn't prevail this time around, no single election defines a movement. So keep the faith, keep fighting for what you know is right. It's never the wrong time to do the right thing and to fight for the right thing. So again, I appreciate your efforts. And as we try to build a state that's fair, a state that has fair representation, that has openness, that has transparency, that involves all communities and says, every single one of you matter. You're all part of this incredible democratic process that we have. It's important that we look at our democratic machinery. And what Michael and Rosalind have just set forth are all of the key fundamental principles that help make redistricting fair, transparent. That's my dog Lego, who is trying to get in on the input on this on the democratic machinery that we follow. Sorry for all you Lord of the Rings fans. That's Lego, short for Legolas. And we need to make sure that our democratic machinery is fair from the get-go. We had an incredible outpouring of involvement. Voters turned in their ballots, got to the polls, mailed them in. But a lot of the democratic structure is set before the election even starts, and it's done through redistricting. It's done through a process that happens in conjunction with the census results every 10 years. And so we heard a lot about the important components of fair state elections, state districting and congressional districting. When I was first elected in 2012, I ran in a redistricted seat. It was the first election after redistricting done by our independent commission. It was also happened to be the first year of the top two primary, and also the implementation of and the applicability of the new term limit. So a lot was happening at once. What we learned about redistricting at the state level taught a lot of lessons for what we need to do at the city and county level. And the city and county redistricting, local redistricting was very much has been very much the Wild West, wide open, with no restrictions, no guardrails, no protections against gerrymandering, no protections and seeing of communities of interest, no fair notice so that communities could be involved, provide input, participate in hearings, no language access requirements so that communities with language access barriers could participate as well. And so we looked at that with a wonderful group of good government advocates, social justice warriors, and champions. I just want to shout them out: California Common Cause, Asian Americans Advancing Justice California, California League of United Latin American Citizens, League of Women Voters of California, and Mi Familia Vota were the co-sponsors of the Fair Maps Act that I authored in 2019, AB 849. And it set about to address each one of those issues that I just mentioned, all the challenges that existed in local redistricting, addressing the issue of protecting communities of interest, addressing the issue of fighting back against gerrymandering, making sure that there's opportunity for all communities to participate. And I appreciate Rosalind's sort of pause during her presentation to say, why do we do this? Why does it matter? Because this is the fundamentals of our democracy. It's about fairness. It's about every community being seen. It's about nobody's vote being diluted and everyone's being uplifted, everyone having a fair chance at choosing their next representative. And as much as I love the Assembly and the Senate and our state leaders and congressional leaders, they're also important. We also know that so much of politics is local. So who your city council member is, who your mayor is, who your board of supervisors representatives are, absolutely critical. And until 2019, there were no requirements around how districts are created, and we saw examples of the abuse. We saw massive gerrymandering, examples of communities of interest, usually Black and Brown communities, that were gerrymandered around to dilute their voice. We saw that maps could be presented and voted on in the same meeting without any notice to the community to provide feedback or to register their concerns or their input or advice. And so we saw there was no language access requirements. There was no a minimum requirement of hearings, and AB 849 changed all that. So it was historic in how it made more fair our local redistricting process, something that was much needed. Given the work and the progress we've made at the state and congressional redistricting level, we need to do the same for our local redistricting. So proud that we got that done in 2019. This past year, we had a follow-up bill that helped provide some additional buttoning up of the Fair Maps Act and also help fine-tune the timelines given some of the delay we were having during the public health pandemic with our census results coming in. And now together, the two bills, the second one was AB 1276, which went with AB 849. And together, these bills, in my view, create a fair, just, transparent, accountable local redistricting process. And it's in large part due to the learnings that we were able to receive and benefit from at the state level. So I'm proud of what California's accomplished. Not every state, far from it, has an independent redistricting commission. It's more fair, it's not gamed, it's not rigged, it's not gerrymandered. Communities of interest are protected. Those same principles animate and define the local redistricting work that I've had an opportunity to be a part of. So I appreciate your engagement. I appreciate your commitment to making our democracy fair, transparent, accountable, and open, and look forward to continuing to work with all of you with your passion and your energy to always strive for a more perfect democracy here in California and in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Assembly Member. At this time, we're going to get into how redistricting affects the California Democratic Party. I actually have the honor to serve as a co-chair of the Organizational Development Committee, and I am excited to present this information along with our esteemed lead co-chairs, Royce Kelly and Chris Wagaman. Royce Kelly has been active in Democratic politics at the local, state, and national levels for most of his life. He has more than 30 years experience in direct mail, raising money for candidates, including Barbara Boxer, Paul Wellstone, Jesse Jackson, and Barbara Lee, and previously served as senior legislative staff in the state legislature. Royce is also now the treasurer of the Alameda County Democratic Central Committee. Chris Wagaman is an active California Democratic Party volunteer, as well as having served as staff in coordinating candidate campaigns. She's involved in her county central committee, as well as state and national party. Most recently, she served as legislative staff consultant for the Assembly Select Committee on the Census, working with local government, nonprofits, and organizations throughout California. So with that, let's get the slide deck up and let's get started. Next, please. So what you have in front of you is the CDP bylaws on the regions, and it's in Article 1, Section 4, if you want to look this up yourself, but essentially actually talks about the charge given to the Organizational Development Committee on redistricting and what that means. Next slide, please. So the key points here on the regions is that the regions are defined by the assembly districts. So as a lot of you are activists in the CDP know, we have different regions cut up and down the state. And so all these regions have to have the same number of assembly districts. The exception is you can divide up to 2 regions, but each sub-region must be made up of at least 2 assembly districts. And redistricting to be done is to be done by the Organizational Development Committee and approved at the Executive Board or Convention. Royce, is there anything you want to add to this?
No, just that the requirement that we have equal assembly districts started 10 years ago. Didn't do that before then, and so we find that same process this time, which does make drawing the maps a little tricky.
Thank you so much, Royce. Next slide, please. So another highlight that we'll have right here is the CDP bylaws on regional directors. This is in Article 4, Section 4. And it says there shall be 1625 regional directors for the CDP with its statewide officers, etc. So if you want to look this up yourself, go on ahead. It's right there. Next slide, please. So the key points here for the regional directors is the number of regional directors, thus the regions, are between 16 and 25. So with 80 assembly districts and equal numbers of 80s per region, there must be 16 regions of 5 assembly districts each, or 20 regions of 4 assembly districts each. And as an FYI, the regional directors are elected in odd number years. Anything you want to add, Royce?
Nope, it's good.
All right, next, please. From the CDP bylaws on the Organizational Development Committee that we serve on. So this is Article 5, Section 5. It basically lays out the duty of the Organizational Development Committee and our role in the redistricting. Next slide, please. And the key point here, the key takeaway is that the Organizational Development Committee regional redistricting happens only after a state plan is adopted. Next slide, please. And so what you have in front of you now is the redistricting timeline. In spring of next year, 2021, is convention where regional directors are elected under the current lines we have. And then December of next year of 2021, the state plan must be adopted by the redistricting committee, which is a lot of what Micah and Rosalind was talking about earlier. And then in June of 2022, the first election is conducted under the new drawn lines. In fall of 2022, the executive board is the last opportunity to adopt new regional lines. And going into spring of 2023, in a little over 2 years from now, is the convention where the regional directors are going to be elected under the new lines that are created. Royce, anything you want to highlight or add here?
Just to remind people that that December 2021 date is a little squishy. They may get a plan out earlier, but they don't have to at this point.
Great, thank you so much, Royce. Next slide, please. And so the key points here on the timeline is the new regional lines are effective in 2023. The O&D committee line drawing may have to start as late as December of 2021, so in a year from now. And the line drawing process must end by fall of 2022, so almost about an entire year of that entire process. Next slide, please. And then this is CDP bylaws on the charter district level organizations. You can see that right there. Charters of geographically based organizations are automatically revoked December 31st of the calendar year from the passage of reapportionment. So you can definitely look this up on the CDP bylaws, which by the way is on the CADEM website. If you want to look that up yourself and any other things that will be helpful to you. Next slide, please. And so the key point here for district level organizations is that charters terminate December of 2021, so in a year from now, and limited time to charter groups under new lines before the primary. Royce, anything you want to add or highlight here?
I just want to say the last time we did this, there was a scramble to get new groups chartered. As Michael pointed out, the commission was formed much later in the cycle than it was this time, but they still may be delayed because of the census data. So it could be a very short time if people want to become active for the 2022 elections. It won't have much time to create a district level organization, which traditionally were based on assembly districts, but more recently we've chartered very active groups, for example, on the congressional district level, and may want to do that again. So people need to start thinking now if there's areas where they want to create those kinds of local groups to facilitate our campaign work.
Great, thank you so much, Royce. Next slide, please.
Is that it?
I think that's the last slide. So thank you so much, Royce and Chris, who is also with us. So at this time, we'll take a couple of questions that was submitted to us through the Q&A. And I think Rosalind would like to answer the first question there. The first question here is, we are slated to possibly lose 1 or 2 congressional districts. Any update, and did the census manipulation create this? So Rosalind, do you want to take this one?
There we go. Yes. This is a result of the fact that we may be losing 1 or 2 congressional seats is a combination of factors. Okay. At the outset of this census, California's population has grown less quickly than the populations of other states with faster growing communities. So we did know from the outset that California might not gain a seat or might even lose a seat just because of the population growth in the state. However, there are several things that have jeopardized a fair and accurate count in Census 2020. And these things have a disproportionate impact on California. For example, when the Bureau initially decided that it was going to primarily have the census done online, or promoted the census being done online, many Californians do not have access to broadband or the kind of technology and the technical abilities to use online answering. Another problem is that the Trump administration's immigration enforcement and creating a fear of the government and a fear of census data being used to intimidate or to go after immigrants in the state and Latinos and other groups created an enormous fear of answering the census. Even after the Supreme Court decision got the citizenship question off the census, there was still enormous lingering fears about whether or not you should answer it. Then, of course, the pandemic comes along. And with the pandemic, the ability of the Bureau to do a lot of its field work. Many of our undercounted populations are reached through people going door to door. And that just completely was a challenge for getting good data from California. Plus that the Census Bureau from the administration has now been directed to basically rush data processing for the census. When the Bureau knew about the pandemic, it came up with a new operational plan that would have given it 5 months to process data. Under the current problems it has, it now only has 2.5 months, and that data processing is really essential. So when you put all of this together, it's a combination of some of it's just not natural demographic factors, but there's several things the Trump administration has done and deliberately to create barriers for getting a fair and accurate count of Californians, which could result in a loss of 2 congressional seats.
Great, thank you so much for that, Rosalind. For our next question, will the commission tweak the existing districts or reshuffle the deck as if no districts? Do we have a sense of their attitude?
So one thing I'd say just on the outset is that even if you think the current lines are perfect, and even if the current commission thought the current lines were perfect, the lines will change. And it's for reasons that Roz pointed out earlier, which is that there have been population shifts in the last 10 years. So the Bay Area, the Inland Empire have grown faster than LA and the Central Valley. As Roz noted, there's a possibility there'll be fewer congressional seats. So that by definition means those will have to be drawn. It also means that even if without those population shifts, there have been demographic shifts. So some of the laws may apply differently. So for example, during the last redistricting, I believe they were only able to draw one API district that was majority minority. This time I'm seeing estimates that there could be 3 or more, depending on how the census data comes out. And that applies not only to the state redistricting to local redistricting as well, where you might have local lines, but those have to be adjusted because the demographics have changed in those cities, some of them quite dramatically in the last 10 years. And even after all of that, there's also been legal changes. So one thing we didn't talk about is that the states or the US Supreme Court largely gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which has driven a lot of how the Central Valley is driven. And so that'll be under a new legal paradigm from 10 years ago. All that said, the last redistricting was had to deal with a brand new set of rules for who was holding the pen, which we don't have to deal with this time. And it had to also deal with a whole new set of criteria. So just as local redistricting may be very different this time versus 10 years ago, as the assembly member noted that those new criteria have been applied, the criteria are basically the same from what they were 10 years ago. So there are reasons to think that the changes may not be as dramatic, but there will be changes.
Thank you so much, Michael. Is there anyone else that want to add anything before we go to our final question for today? I'll take that as a no. So our final question for today's event is, how do our state timelines relate to other state schedules? And how will this affect the districts for the 2022 Senate race?
So a lot of states have been struggling with the same issues that we talked about in California, where even, for example, if they have legislative, the legislature still holds the pen. Some of the timelines for states where they have part-time commissions didn't line up with the potential changes to the timeline for when census data would be released. So lots of states are struggling with these issues. It's, again, the reason the legislature brought litigation in California to try to provide a little bit more time for the state commission so that they would know that they would have the time to do the job right. Not necessarily that they would need to take the full amount of time, but they would have that time that they needed. For 2022, I'm not sure if they're referring to U.S. Senate races or state Senate races. For the U.S. Senate races, those are really not impacted by redistricting because those are statewide contests. For state redistricting, the even numbered seats will be up in 2022, and then the under the new lines, and then the odd numbered seats will be up in 2024 under the new line. So there's a 2-year kind of transition period for the state Senate for the new lines to come online.
Thank you so much. Any other panelists want to add to that? Great. Thank you all so much for joining us for this really informative webinar, and special thank you to our amazing speakers, Michael, Rosalind, Assemblymember Bonta, Royce, and Chris. Please reach out if you have any additional questions, and I want to give a special shout out to staff for their hard work in putting this together. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful afternoon.